And the last few sessions we've been in the prophecy of Daniel. We've had a look at a number of things, and I'm resisting the temptation to go over what we've done, because that would be a waste of time, really. If you weren't here, you missed out, and that's that. But we're moving on tonight into chapter 11. And before we do, rather than have a reading, if I might just skim over some of the key verses here in chapters 10 and 11. Chapter 10 is really the introduction to this whole thing. It provides the context to chapter 11. We're not going to do chapter 10 in any great length, but I thought it's worthwhile just starting out with a little bit of this context. Chapter 10 of Daniel. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, and that's important, it's an important date. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a revelation was given to Daniel, who was called Belteshazzar, that's his Babylonian name. Its message was true, and it concerned a great war. The understanding of the message came to him in a vision. At that time, I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. I want you to think about what it means to receive the revelation of God directly. That's why in my prayer I say, I'm going to be thankful for what these prophets put up with, all of them. They went through shocking things, really. Terrible traumas. To receive the word of God and to try to then have to deal with it. At the time I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. I ate no choice food, no meat or wine touched my lips, and I used no lotions at all until the 3 weeks were over. On the 24th day of the 1st month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river, the Tigris, I looked up, and there before me was a man dressed in linen, with a belt of the finest gold round his waist, and his body was like chrysolite, his face like lightning, etc. It's a terrible, terrible sight. And verse 7, I, Daniel, was the only one who saw the vision. The men with me did not see it, but such terror overwhelmed them that they fled and hid themselves. It reminds me of Paul, on the road to Damascus in Acts 9. No one else, Paul heard the voice, they all saw the light and fell down. They all fell down, of course. Verse 8, so I was left alone, gazing at the great vision. I had no strength left, my face turned deathly pale, and I was helpless. Helpless. Note that. Then I heard him speaking, and as I listened to him I fell into a deep sleep, my face to the ground. And a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. He said, Daniel, you are highly esteemed. What a wonderful thing to be said by the mighty angel. Consider carefully the words I am about to speak to you, and stand up, for I have now been sent to you. And when he said this to me, I stood up, trembling. Then he said, do not be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them. But the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days, and at this point you think, look, let's not get into this. It's, as I said to the South people this morning, South Adelaide, it's too scary. Don't bother with all this detail, it's just context. Verse 14, now I have come to explain to you what will happen to your people in the future. For the vision concerns a time yet to come. That's an important verse, because all of this is about to be revealed in the next chapter. Verse 15, while he was saying this to me, I bowed my face toward the ground and was speechless. And then the one who looked like a man touched my lips, and I opened my mouth and began to speak. And I said to the one standing before me, I am overcome with anguish because of the vision, my Lord, and I am helpless. How can I, your servant, talk with you, my Lord? My strength is gone and I can hardly breathe. Again, the one who looked like a man touched me and gave me strength. Do not be afraid, O man highly esteemed, he said. Peace. Be strong now, be strong. And he spoke to me. When he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, speak, my Lord, since you have given me strength. And he did. And we go to chapter 11, verse 2, and the vision begins. Now then, I will tell you the truth, says the angel. And here's Daniel having to take all this in. And we're not going to read all of this, but let me just give you the gist of this and sort of what it's about. Verse 2, because this chapter is a very famous prophecy. Very puzzling one, as all the things in Daniel are. Verse 2, now then, I tell you the truth. 3 more kings will appear in Persia, and then a 4th. He will be far richer than all the others. And when he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. And then a mighty king will appear who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. And after he has appeared, his empire will be broken up and parcelled out toward the 4 winds of the heavens. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others. And the king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he and will rule his kingdom with great power, and after some years they will become allies. The daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance. And so it goes on, and the rest of the chapter, most of it, is a narrative about what happens between the king of the north and the king of the south, whoever they are. We're going to come to that in a moment, because this is one of the classic Bible examples of what we call continuous historic prophecy. It's quite clearly continuous historic. There's a revelation of the history that was going to come over the next 200 years as far as the Jews were concerned. And it carries on like this about the king of the north and the king of the south and what they do. And as we'll see shortly, the details are just so accurate historically as to what happened over the next 250 years that many critics of the Bible have actually said, well, this couldn't be prophecy, it's got to be written after the event. Couldn't be that accurate. And literally that's one of the great criticisms of this. I mean, it couldn't be Daniel. I mean, he couldn't have got it that right, because it wasn't Daniel that was being actually given to him. And then we come down to the critical verses that we're going to be looking at in particular in the latter part of tonight, and that's from about verse 36. But if we just read well, from verse 36, the king, and it's not specified here who the king is. This could be king of the north, king of the south, or the king of the whoever. We don't know. The prophecy doesn't say, and this is one of the strange twists in this prophecy, and why this prophecy has become so famous, really. Verse 36, the king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. It's already beginning to sound like that rotten little horn we found in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, who was a boastful horn and spoke against God and did all sorts of nasty, beginning to sound like the little horn. And he will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or the one desired by women, whatever that means, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. Instead of them he will honour a god of fortresses, a god unknown to his fathers he will honour with gold and silver, and so it goes on. And then at verse 40, it says, at the time of the end, and that's where all of us get excited and say, my gosh, I wonder if that's now, time of the end, last day stuff. At the time of the end, the king of the south, there's still a king of the south involved, will engage him in battle, engage the king in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships, and he will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land, the holy land, the promised land. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon, which is basically all modern day Jordan, Amman, capital of Jordan, and so on, all in that area, will be delivered from his hand. He will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape. He will gain control over the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt, with the Libyans and Ethiopians in submission. But reports from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. But the prophecy doesn't actually finish there. It goes on into the early part of chapter 12, which we won't be able to have a look at tonight. But just note that chapter 12 continues. At that time, Michael, whoever Michael is, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. And there will be a time of distress or trouble such as not happened from the beginning of nations until then. This sounds like the time of Jacob's trouble from Jeremiah chapter 30, doesn't it? But at that time your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, close up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge. And Daniel then goes on, how long is this going to take? And he's told a little bit about that, and that's what we're going to look at, God willing, next time as well. But I just wanted you to note here the general gist of this prophecy. The context is in chapter 10. It's then in chapter 11 all about this dialogue between, or this narrative between, about the king of the south, king of the north, and then there's this other king who comes into it towards the end of chapter 11 and does some interesting things at the time of the end. Sounds like the little horn and whatever. And then clearly in the beginning of chapter 12, we're right there. We're at the resurrection and judgment and the time of trouble for Israel, and it's all one. So we do know that this prophecy, whatever we make of this prophecy, brings us clearly to the time of the end. So I've marked it out there, chapter 11 verse through to chapter 12 verse 4. And as I say, it's really all one single prophecy, because chapter 12, as we've just noted, begins with at that time. That is, at the time we've left off at the end of chapter 11. And secondly, it's clearly a time of the end prophecy because chapter 12 verse 2 brings us to judgment and resurrection. And furthermore, Jesus himself, speaking of the last days, actually makes reference to those early verses of Daniel chapter 12 in the Olivet prophecy. So we know that this is something that brings us really close to the end. All of this from Daniel 11 verse 2 right through to 12 verse 4, it's all the single one prophecy. Okay. It begins, and we're not going to go through this, all the verses, because there's too many verses to go through, but we'll just go through a sample of how to deal with this. Chapter 11 verse 2, Daniel is told that 3 more kings will appear in Persia, and then a 4th king who will be far richer than all the others. And when that 4th king has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. He'll want to overreach his power. Now, we do know that this prophecy was given in the 3rd year of the reign of Cyrus. And we know that because Daniel 10 verse 1 tells us. Remember I said when I started the reading, Daniel 10 verse 1, 3rd year of Cyrus. We know that, and we know that that is about 535 BC. Pick up any history book, it'll tell you. So Daniel 10 verse 1 tells us that the prophecy was given in the 3rd year of the reign of Cyrus, and Daniel 10 is a narrative introduction to chapters 11 and 12 as we've seen tonight. So 3 more kings will appear in Persia. And the 3 more kings after Cyrus, the next 3 referred to here in chapter 11 verse 2, were Cambyses, 529 to 522, Smerdis, very short period of time, and Darius. There were several Dariuses, I think, but that was another Darius, from 521 to 485 BC. We know that. There's the 3 more kings. Now, what about the 4th, who would be richer than all the others and stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece? Well, that 4th king was Xerxes. And he reigned from 486 to 465 BC, so for about 21 years there. And the reality was with Xerxes that he did have unusual wealth, which enabled him to establish vast, well-equipped armies. He was the great military king, one of the great military kings of Persia. And in 480 BC, he overreached, really. He invaded Greece, because Greece was a little upstart kingdom at the time in Macedonia, and he invaded Greece with a huge army and navy, but he was surprisingly and ignominiously defeated. The Greeks knocked him out. And he went back to Persia with his tail between his legs, and thus began the long and steady downfall of the Medo-Persian Empire. And it took a long time. It wasn't as though the Greeks sort of knocked him out and then took over. I mean, he invaded the Greeks. So when they beat him in battle, he wandered away, as I say, very much ashamed about the whole thing, went back to Persia and licked his wounds. And so we see the decline, the steady decline of the Medo-Persian Empire. And it took a long time for that empire to decline. But certainly after Xerxes defeating Greece in 480 BC, its superpower status was lost forever. It was in decline. And therefore, from Daniel chapter 11 verse 3, the prophecy just forgets about the Medes and the Persians, and it moves to the next superpower of relevance to the Jews in their homeland, which was, of course, the kingdom of Greece, the rise of Greece. And chapter 11 verse 3 says, "Then a mighty king will appear who will rule with great power and do as he pleases." And, of course, we are introduced to our old friend Alexander. Alexander the Great, who in a short period of 13 years basically conquered the world. The then known world, and even more of it. As I've indicated before, he even went as far as the northern reaches of India. He was truly, I think, the most amazing military genius in history. And even that. You remember that, of course, back in Daniel 7, he's regarded as the leopard. The Greek Empire as the leopard. It moved so quickly, so fast. He was the original exponent of blitzkrieg. And he truly did as he pleased, including successfully invading Persia to avenge the wrongs of Xerxes in invading Greece 150 years earlier. He wasn't around then, but the Greeks had long memories, and he said, we'll take on Persia as well, and he did, and he defeated them, and that was it. The Persian Empire was completely gone, and he took over. And chapter 4 of Daniel 11 says, after he has appeared, Alexander, his empire will be broken up and parcelled out toward the four winds of heaven. It won't go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others. Now, he did have descendants. He did. He left three possible heirs. There was a half-brother of his called Philip, who was mentally deficient. So there would have been problems there anyway. But he had a legitimate son, and born after Alexander died. And there was also an illegitimate son. But predictably, now if you know anything about ancient history, you should know what I'm going to say next. What's predictable about ancient history? What happened to those three heirs?
Probably got murdered.
Of course they did. All three were quickly assassinated, and to put it in a mathematical formula, 3 minus 3 equals zip. So there's no one, none of his heirs can take it over. It's all good stuff. And it says it won't go to his descendants, but his empire will be uprooted and given to others. And we've already covered this in previous sessions. The kingdom was then divided among 4 of his generals. Seleucus, who took over the area of Syria and Mesopotamia in the far east. Ptolemy, who took over the south, Egypt and North Africa down there. Lysimachus, Thrace and Asia Minor, which was sort of to the north and east. And the home territory, the homeland Cassandra over Macedonia and Greece. Now these visions and insights into the empires of Persia and Greece are relevant because at some time each empire attempted to wipe out the Jews, or at least destroy Jewish customs and religious traditions. The Persian Empire during the reign of Xerxes through the plot of Haman, as recorded in the book of Esther. And the Grecian Empire during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, who we've also covered in previous sessions, where Antiochus set out to kill every Jew who didn't renounce their commitment to the one God and embrace Greek culture with its many gods, as prophesied in Daniel in several places. So all of this is relevant for these reasons. And after Alexander, though, the Jews in their homeland came into contact with only 2 of those 4 kingdoms. Only 2 of them. The Seleucids. And the Seleucid kings, because Seleucus, who was the first of them, he was one of the generals of Alexander. That's another thing they did in the old days. If you took over a country, you became a king and set up your own dynasty, right? That's what you did. So these 4 generals all became kings, self-proclaimed kings, set up their dynasties, and their children became kings, and so it went down. And the Seleucid dynasty lasted for quite a long time, as also did the Ptolemies, and that's the king of the south. And we get down to some interesting times. We're actually going to look next week a little bit where we even get down to Cleopatra and all that sort of stuff, and Mark Antony. The Bible talks about them, it does. It's all here in Daniel actually about what happened. Fascinating stuff. And Daniel 11 then proceeds to outline in amazing detail the next 200 years or so of the history of the interaction between the king of the south, who happens to be, and it's sort of a generic king of the south, whoever the ruling Ptolemy was at the time, all right? Whoever the ruling Ptolemy was, he was the king of the south, and whoever the ruling Seleucid king was, well, he was the king of the north. And the prophecy just continues in a continuous historic sense like this. And of course the Jews in their homeland were caught up in the middle. Right in the middle, the buffer zone. It's a bit like poor old Poland has always been caught between Russia and Germany. All right, Second World War type stuff. Russia and Germany hate each other. Oh, they come up to a pact, and then they built that life out of Poland, and then of course the Germans take over, and then the Russians come in. It was the same sort of thing, king of the north, king of the south, that sort of thing, with the Holy Land being the buffer zone between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and it went on like that for a couple of hundred years. So back to the prophecy, verse 5, the king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders, not one of the king of the south's commanders, but one of Alexander's commanders. This is where we've got to be careful with the use of pronouns in this, and there's going to be a little exercise in pronoun use later on in this chapter, I can tell you. The king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he, and will rule his own kingdom with great power. And after some years they will become allies. The daughter of the king of the south, you don't think just because they were offshoots of Alexander's kingdom that they were all good mates. They weren't. Once you set up separate kingdoms, there's another rule of ancient history. You sort of never get on with anyone if you can. You're always trying to knock them off. So after some years they'll become allies. The daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance, but she won't retain her power, and he and his power will not last. In those days she'll be handed over, together with her royal escort and her father and the one who supported her. What on earth does history make of this? Well, the king of the south will become strong. Now, the king of the south who became strong was the first Ptolemy, Ptolemy I, Soter. He was given authority over Egypt in 323 BC. That was very early in the piece. That was on the death, immediately upon the death of Alexander. Ptolemy is told, you look after that part of the empire. He probably decides to do it himself. The general's in conference. He was proclaimed king of Egypt some 19 years later in 304 BC. Well, that's it. I've been ruler here long enough. Time to make myself a king. That's what you do. And so that was the king of the south. The king, he became strong. But one of the commanders will become stronger, and that other one was Seleucus. Seleucus, the other general, he became Seleucus the first. And he was also one of Alexander's 4 inheriting generals, as I've indicated. He was given authority to rule in Babylon, which was the sort of a good area for all that far eastern part of the empire, in 321. And again, he assumed the title of king of Syria, Babylonia and Media, not a bad little triumvirate there, in 305. And thus Seleucus actually ruled over far more territory than Ptolemy, really, and was given he was king of the largest part, clearly the largest part of the post-Alexander kingdoms. So Seleucus got probably the biggest slice of the cake when it was all said and done. But they were both pretty strong characters. And after some years they will become allies. Now Ptolemy I died in 285. He'd been king for about 20 years. And his son, Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, he ruled in Egypt for a long time, nearly 40 years. Now, meanwhile, Seleucus was murdered in 281. It was a health hazard in those days, and he got murdered, and Antiochus I Sotus ruled until 262. He was followed by Seleucus' grandson, Antiochus II. Now, Ptolemy II and Antiochus were initially bitter enemies. But they finally entered into an alliance in 250 BC, and as Daniel says there, after some years they will become allies. In 250 BC, yep, they became allies, and this is how they did it. Daniel says the daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance. Well, it's true. Ptolemy II gave his daughter Berenice in marriage to Antiochus II on condition that Antiochus divorced his own wife Laodice. Bit rough, sort of, I suppose it could still happen today, but that's what happened. Anyway, a deal's a deal. But Ptolemy, poor old Ptolemy, he died soon after this deal, and Antiochus II then divorced Berenice and took back Laodice instead. Oh dear. And Laodice, she must have been at peace, because she showed her gratitude by murdering Berenice and poisoning Antiochus, her husband, as well, for good measure, making her son Seleucus Callinicus king in his place. So you can get the drift here. There's a marriage, Ptolemy goes, poor old Ptolemy, second he goes. And then Antiochus says, I didn't like Berenice much anyway. She can go, I'll have my old wife back again. And I mean, she gets back at them all, right? And her son gets on the throne. Let me tell you, ancient history only gets worse. When you get to the Romans, it even gets worse than this. But you see how accurate this prophecy is. And the prophecy continues like this right through to the end of the chapter at verse 45. You could say, look, what's all this got to do with us now? It's all ancient history and therefore not of direct relevance today. But I did want to show you that the prophecy is extraordinarily accurate. And you don't have to be a great student of history to understand this. All you've got to do is pick up almost any Bible commentary. If you've got a Bible, even one of those Bibles that's got little notes down the bottom or something, it'll tell you about all this. It'll tell you about it. This is non-controversial. Everyone, all Bible students, doesn't matter who they are, they know all this sort of stuff. It's just basic ancient history. And it all happened so accurately. Now, some of it reinforces things we've already learned. For example, there is a long section in the prophecy about the horrendous exploits of Antiochus Epiphanes. A long section indeed. Verse 21, in fact. Interesting to follow this through. We didn't read it when I was reading it through earlier, but he, it says, will be succeeded by a contemptible person who has not been given the honour of royalty. Now, the he referred to in there in verse 21 is actually one of these Seleucid kings, Seleucus IV, son of Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great. And Seleucus IV, he was the eldest son of Antiochus the Great, Antiochus III. And he ruled for about 11 years there, from 187 to 176. And he was eventually poisoned by one of his chief officials, Heliodorus, who wanted the throne for himself. So the chief of staff wanted to take over the throne. That's the end of Seleucus. But Heliodorus figured it was a good time to act because the only son and heir of Seleucus IV, his master, Demetrius, was being held hostage in Rome. You see, Rome was a developing empire at this stage, and Rome wanted to keep all these Seleucids and the Ptolemies in check, and that Rome was becoming a bit of a superpower, the world's policeman, didn't much like what was going on in the empire of the Seleucids, and so a deal was done whereby Demetrius, the heir of Seleucus IV, Demetrius, you come to Rome and you can have the high life in Rome, but you stay here with us. So your father then is going to do the right thing over there. So Heliodorus thinks, well, the only son and heir is held hostage in Rome. Now's a good time to knock off Seleucus and I can be king. You get the drift? But he didn't figure on the political genius and ambition of the younger brother of Seleucus IV, Antiochus, who with great diplomatic skill and flattery courted various allies, including the Romans, to whom he promised to pay a backlog of tribute money that had been owing, and was one of the reasons that Demetrius was already held hostage in Rome, and he assumed the throne with their approval. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes was really a political genius, a real sleaze bag, I've got to say, but he was a cheat and a nasty sort of operator. But he became the infamous Antiochus Epiphanes, or the illustrious one, or Epimanes, as some nicknamed him, meaning madman. And the ancient Greek, he was generally the ancient Greek equivalent of the Romans. He was the Greek equivalent of the Romans' Nero. It was also crazy. And of course we come to him in the 1st century. And Daniel describes him as a vile or contemptible person who had not been given the honour of royalty because he had seized the throne illegally. And the rest of Daniel 11, 21 to 35, the whole of it, is in fact devoted to Antiochus. The whole of it. Not going to look at it tonight. Interesting though to do so. Just one thing I do want to look at. Let's skip some of the earlier historical detail and move to the end of his reign from verses 29 to 35, because I find this quite interesting. Verse 29, at the appointed time, he, Antiochus Epiphanes, will invade the south again. This was the second time he'd tried to take over the kingdom of the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies and the Seleucids are always trying, they're at each other's throats. They could never quite get the upper hand over each other, but they're always having a go at each other. And as I say, Israel, the promised land, was sort of in the middle of the buffer zone. So at the appointed time, Antiochus will invade the south again, and he did. He invaded Egypt, but this time the outcome will be different. Ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, and he will lose heart. What do you think that refers to? The western coastlands? Well, in 168 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes invaded Egypt, and Ptolemy VI, he was the ruling Ptolemy at the time, he hired mercenaries from Greece, and they were going to have a big stoush. A major confrontation was looming, but it was averted only by the intervention of a maritime delegation from Rome. Ships of the western coastlands. The Roman Empire, which was beginning to emerge, as I indicated, as the new superpower, the emerging world policeman, the sort of like United States of those couple of hundred years or so. And ships of the western coastlands will oppose him and he'll lose heart. It's exactly what happened. Because there's a wonderful story. An ambassador from the Senate in Rome, Popilius Lernus, met Antiochus near Alexandria, there in Egypt, requesting that he withdraw. And when Antiochus sought time to consider, he wanted time to consider his options, Popilius famously drew a circle around him in the sand and he demanded that he give him an answer there and then. I want your answer now. Otherwise you can consider yourself at war with Rome. Now what is a good self-respecting Seleucid to do? You go away. That's what you do. You go away at that point, and he did. Ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, and he lost heart. But by golly, he was mad. And at the appointed time, there you go, ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, he'll lose heart. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. He will return and show favour to those who break the Holy Covenant. And that's what he did. You won't let me have a go at Egypt, but you won't care if I have a go at those people in the middle. So he went back to Jerusalem. His armed forces, it says, will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. They will set up the abomination that causes desolation, which was effectively the image of Zeus in the temple. He put up the image of Zeus and said, you're going to worship that. And with flattery he will corrupt those who are violent. Imagine the thing, many of the Jews wanting to save their skin decided, yes, we'll suddenly convert to everything Grecian. And of course the faithful vigorously opposed it and they got killed. In fact, I forget the figures. The figures were astronomical. The number of people who are either killed or sold into slavery or whatever. I mean, we're talking, I don't think it was hundreds, but it was certainly tens of thousands. And it all happened in a very short period of time. And basically the reason for it, Antiochus was mad. He was so cross that the Romans turned him back from Egypt that he just had to let loose. And I think there is another approach to Daniel 11 which you probably haven't heard of before, but which I think makes more sense. Now, whether it sort of clarifies our overall view of prophecy or not is another thing altogether. I mean, we might be taking a step backwards here in some respects, in the sense that we might be complicating the whole thing. I'm not sure, but just I want to put this proposal on Daniel 11 to you, see what you think. And then we'll move into chapter 12 and hopefully round off what we've got to say about Daniel tonight. Now, this is chapter 11. All the slides won't be as detailed as this, but let's just read these relevant verses through from verse 36. You remember in Daniel 11, we have most of it from verses pretty much up to verse 1 to 35. We've got this constant narrative about the king of the north and the king of the south. The king of the north was basically the relevant king of the day of the Seleucid kingdoms based up in Syria. And the Seleucid empires, remember, came out of the Greek Empire. And there were various Seleucid kings, and perhaps the most infamous of all was Antiochus Epiphanes, and we saw what he did. And chapter 11 talks about Antiochus and all those things. And then we had the king of the south, which was another one of those four branches of the Grecian kingdom of Alexander. And that was originally set up by one of his generals, Ptolemy, and from there the Ptolemaic dynasty came down. And you had various Ptolemy kings, the kings of the south. And the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, they kept fighting each other, and Israel was in the middle. It was in the middle and got squeezed most of the time. It was a bit like Poland in between Russia and Germany. Always got sort of squeezed in the middle. And the chapter 11 of Daniel, it continues in some quite remarkable detail, what we call, it's a continuous historic thing. There's no question about that. It just outlines what's going to happen from the time of Daniel right through up to the time of, well, time of the end of Antiochus Epiphanes. It even covers a bit of the time of the Maccabees and so on. And everyone's been a little puzzled at the fact that from about verse 36 of chapter 11, there seems to be a gap. There seems to be a gap because suddenly verse 36 talks about a new character, a character called the King. And people say, well, which king are we talking about here? Previously it's been quite specific, either the king of the north or the king of the south, but here it seems to be a new character altogether. Let's just read what it says. The king, from verse 36, the king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. Instead of them he will honour a god of fortresses. A god unknown to his fathers he will honour with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god, and will greatly honour those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people, and will distribute the land at a price. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships, and he will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hand. He will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape. He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt, with the Libyans and Ethiopians in submission. But reports or tidings from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. And there ends chapter 11 of Daniel. And so that raises a number of issues for us, issues that we briefly looked at last time. Who is or are the persons behind the pronouns? I mean, if we go back here from verse 40, halfway down there, you say, at the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him. Hey, which him's that? Is that the king of the north? Oh, it couldn't be the king of the north, and the king of the north, so the him, it seems to be the king. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage the king, from verse 36, whoever that is, in battle, which seems to be, although it might, of course, that him might be referring back to all the things that took place before verse 36. It might actually be talking about the king of the north, back from prior to verse 36. And there's nothing in the text, there's nothing in the grammar that indicates who that pronoun him there in the beginning of verse 40 is. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him. Him. Which him's that? King of the north or the king? I mean, if you just read it through in English, you say, well, it looks like the him, the king of verse 36. That's the way we'd read it in English. But it could be referring back to the king of the north in the earlier verses, if you see what I mean. So we said that who is or are the person or persons behind the pronouns? Is the king in the middle, the king of the north, sometimes one, sometimes the other? And there's not a lot really to help us in all this. Now, what has caused most commentators to say that there must be a gap between verse 35 and the beginning of that passage that we read from verse 36 is the fact that they've been unable to find anyone among the successors of Antiochus Epiphanes who even remotely fits the description of the king from verse 36. Antiochus Epiphanes, with all the dreadful things he did to the Jews, he was about 170, 165 thereabouts BC. And after him, the Seleucid kings kept going for about another 100 years. But frankly, they went downhill, really. There was no outstanding king and no nasty king either, really, who came after Antiochus Epiphanes. They were all a bit ho-hum, really. No one reached the depths of wickedness that he did. no one to write home about at all. So that's one of the difficulties. And then, of course, if we try to fit all this into a last day context, we get into troubles like, you know, this person, king, whoever it is, king of the north, king in the middle or whatever, attacks Egypt for all the riches and the treasures of Egypt. And you look at Egypt today and say, well, goodness me, that hardly applies. And then you've got people like Harry Whittaker saying, oh, but it's all to do with the Aswan Dam or something. No, it just doesn't cut it, I don't think. I mean, Egypt is a basket case today. You wouldn't invade Egypt for its riches and treasures. It hadn't got any. And then people say, oh, the Suez Canal, doesn't do it for me. I don't know. So where do we go from here? Well, that's what's caused the problems. Most commentators say, well, it's got to take us right through to the end time in some way, because there's been no one among the successors of Antiochus Epiphanes who even remotely fits that description. But what if the agreed continuous historic approach of the earlier part of the chapter had not entirely finished by the time we reach verse 36? What if? What if it continues to be continuous historic right through? What if? What if the king wasn't a descendant of Antiochus at all? What if the king was someone like Herod the Great? That's at that point, El, where I said you'd say, oh, I should have known that. It's really interesting, you know. Herod the Great was a huge character, a massively important character, and he was the king of the Jews at the time of the birth of Jesus. Wouldn't it be strange if prophecy didn't pay him any attention at all? He'd been king for 40 years. And he's an interesting character. You're going to find out a little bit more about it. What do we know about Herod? We know he was born in 73 BC. He was the son of Antipater, who was a high public servant, actually. I could probably put him that in a number of the administrations in Israel. And he was an Idumean, or an Edomite, one of the descendants of Esau. And although Herod was not a full-blooded Jew, he was, for all intents and purposes, he was a Jew, because along with many other Idumean families, his ancestors had come to live in Judea some decades before, integrating with Jewish society and culture. Now, I'll tell you when that had happened. In the days of the Maccabees, you know, when the Maccabees, after Antiochus Epiphanes, about 160 BC, they freed up the temple worship and whatever. The big trouble with the Maccabees is that they got rid of the Greeks because they wanted religious freedom. So having established religious freedom for the Jews, they then tried to impose the Jewish religion on everyone they could get their hands on, including the Edomites and whatever. And there were a number of people down in Edom and Ammon and those areas there who they forced to convert to Judaism and so on. And many of them actually came and transferred into the land of Israel. And the family of Herod the Great was among that lot who actually came to live in Judea. So he was fully integrated into Jewish society, but he wasn't a full-blooded Jew at any point. Very interesting character. Antipater, his father, actually rose to become a sort of a procurator or a governor there at one stage for a few years until he died. And then after that, the Romans, of course, in the time of in this first century BC, the Romans were becoming not an empire at this stage, but they were sort of like the United States of the ancient world in the first century BC. The world's policemen, the Romans were. The world's big enough to tell people, hey, do this, do that, don't do that. Weren't yet the big Roman Empire, but they were getting that way. And they set up Antipater, and after that the Romans, Julius Caesar no less, Julius Caesar set up Herod as king in Judea. So, more about Herod. He was a vicious and evil man of quite extraordinary political cunning. This guy was a real political genius. He knew how to win elections, ha-ha. No elections in his 40 years. He ruled as king in Judea for nearly 40 years, from about 37 BC to just a few years after Jesus was born. And the Herodian dynasty began with Herod the Great. Now remember, at this point, there'd been no one, the Maccabees had ruled, you know, the Hasmonean dynasty, but that had sort of disappeared for some years before Herod came on the scene. And Herod, of course, having been set up by the Romans, he had great ambition and he set up his own dynasty, as they all did in those days. And the Herodian dynasty began with Herod the Great, and it continued through Herod the Great. He was the one who killed the babes of Bethlehem. Herod Antipas, he was the one who put John the Baptist to death. Herod Agrippa I, who killed James and imprisoned Peter. All of these are referred to in the Bible. And finally, Herod Agrippa II, that was the one whom Paul said, you almost persuade me to be a Christian. So that was the Herodian dynasty. And Herod Agrippa II, well, the end of the Herodian dynasty came, of course, when the Romans just swept it all away in AD 70. Now, why should we consider Herod at all? I do find it amazing that Herod, in most of our expositions of Daniel 11, doesn't fit in at all. And I found this quote from someone on the internet, and I think it's terrific. Because, says this writer on the internet, it may be thought strange that in a prophecy that gives prominence to Xerxes, Alexander, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, Antiochus Epiphanes and the Maccabees, everyone agrees with that. It's all continuous historic. It might be considered strange there is no mention of the one person who arguably exerted a greater influence on Jewish affairs than all of them, and who was the only figure actually known as the King of the Jews and acclaimed by the nation as such at the very time Christ was born. It may be thought strange if he's missing, and I think that's pretty true. For now then, this leaves us with two questions. The first one is, how might Herod fit the prophecy? Does he fit? I mean, we've heard about the guy, but how does he fit these verses that we read? And the second thing is, look, if he does fit in, what does this do to our latter-day interpretation? Answer, probably ruins it and we go back to square one, but let's do this for the time being. First, how do the circumstances of Herod's life and reign fit the prophecy about the king from verse 36 that we read? Well, Daniel 11 verse 36 says the king will do as he pleases. It begins there. Now, that same expression, do as he pleases, is only used of two others in Daniel 11. First of all, of Alexander the Great in chapter 11 verse 3. And Alexander was really the greatest military genius in history. There's no doubt about that, I think. He was great. Alexander the Great conquered everything in 13 years. And the other one was Antiochus the Great. This is not Antiochus the Epiphanes. This is a descendant. In fact, I'm not sure whether he is the father of Antiochus. He might have been the grandfather. I'm not quite sure now. But Antiochus the Great, he is the other one referred to in chapter 11 verse 16 as doing as he pleased. Now, all three, Alexander, Antiochus and Herod, all three were not just self-willed, they did what they liked. They were unique in that they were huge achievers. They actually got things done. Poor old Kevin Rudd at the moment's getting his policies right, but he's having difficulty implementing them. But not these guys. They implemented it. They got it done. They were actually able to implement most, if not all, of their policies. I mean, some were evil, some were good, in a relatively unfettered manner. The king will do as his pleasure. It also implies, doesn't it, that phrase, a knack of getting away with it, of never being brought to heel, don't you think? He'll do as he pleases. No one will step in his way. And Herod has always amazed historians in that he successfully contrived to secure the favour and confidence, firstly of Julius Caesar, which is no mean feat. And with Julius Caesar, as I said earlier, who actually installed him. Secondly, of Mark Antony, who succeeded Julius Caesar for a short period of time. And then, finally, and just when it became clear that Antony and Cleopatra were going to be defeated, we're going to come to that in a moment, he actually managed to get in the good books of Octavian, who became the subsequent Caesar Augustus, who was the Caesar at the time of Jesus' birth. And if you understand the Roman politics in the 1st century BC, let me tell you that Julius and Mark Antony and Octavian, they all sort of didn't really like each other, and to get on with all three, you had to be a genius. Mind you, Julius Caesar, he was taken out of it before Antony and Octavian came on together, but I'll come to a little bit of that history in a minute. The prophecy goes on that whoever this king is, he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, little g god, and say unheard of things against the God of gods. Now, when the record says above every little g god, it's really talking, I think, about above every authority and ruler in Israel, above all the little gods in Israel, all the main officials. Now, Herod appointed anyone he liked to any and every office in the land. I suppose any king can do that, but Herod, he was a genius at this. including the priests and the high priests. For example, he appointed his own brother-in-law, Aristobulus, as high priest, and later when Aristobulus did, I know he zigged when he should have zagged or something or other, well, Herod just had him murdered because, you know, you can't have a high priest acting independently. I mean, the king's got to be in control. A control freak. He was. And another, so much so he even put his favourite wife, he had a couple of wives, but Mariamne was one of his real favourite. He put her to death. And also 3 of his sons he had murdered at different times, 3 of his successors murdered because he suspected them of plotting against him. No one was going to come in the way of Herod and his ambition. He exalted and magnified himself above every god, and yet he was never brought to account. He got away with all this. He did as he pleased. And it says, it goes on to say in that verse that he will say unheard of things against the God of gods. Now, this surely is talking about the one true God. And this thing, I think, could refer, couldn't it, especially, but perhaps not exclusively, to Herod's decree for the slaughter of the babies of Bethlehem with the aim of obliterating Messiah, which is a truly foul deed when you think about it. He knew the prophecies of Messiah. He knew about all that. And he was going to... He'd go to war against God if he had to. Oh, this Messiah, God's chosen Messiah, come. We'll get rid of this Messiah before, you know... Amazing pride, an amazing wickedness of this man, saying unheard of things against the God of gods. I can get rid of his Messiah before he even sees the light of day. Fancy saying that against the God of gods. Herod, in fact, was obsessed with putting to death every suspected rival, and as I say there, in many ways he was a bit like an ancient version of Joseph Stalin. And those who know the story of Stalin, it was just dreadful. Anyone who did anything good in the old Russia before the Second World War, anyone who... I mean, when the Second World War began, the Russians' army was flippin' hopeless, and it was hopeless because Stalin had got rid of all the generals who were any good, because he suspected that if they were any good, they might take over from him. Herod was a bit the same, and he was just as bad as Stalin, to put it bluntly. Now the prophecy goes on, he will show no regard for the one desired by women. This is really strange, particularly if we try and put this in a modern context and say, oh, we're looking for some, you know, person who's going to arise today who shows no regard for the... Well, what does that mean? Well, it helps, I think, if we apply it to Herod. The women... It's clearly we're talking, I think, about the women in Israel, and it was said that the one great desire of the women of Israel at or about that time was that they might be the mother of Messiah. And once again, this showing no regard for the one desired by women could be a reference to the slaughter of the children of Bethlehem. You know the old prophecy from Jeremiah, a voice heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children, the mothers of Israel, weeping for their children, refusing to be comforted, for they are no more. He will show no regard for the one desired by the women of Israel. I reckon it fits Herod pretty well. He will honour a God of fortresses, a God unknown to his fathers. He will honour with gold and silver. And we try and say, how could that apply to some modern character? Well, I know about modern characters, but let's look at Herod. A God of fortresses. Now that phrase applies more to the Roman Caesars than anyone else in history. For this reason, it was by means of permanently manned fortresses that the Roman Caesars extended and maintained their power throughout the empire and also enforced the worship they demanded. That was a specific thing about the Romans. Wherever they went, it wasn't just a case of letting the folks get on with it. They had to have a presence. They had to have a presence there to let them know that Rome was in control. And they did that with manned fortifications everywhere. Quite unique. Not unique subsequently. It happened in many other situations subsequent to that time. But the Roman Caesars really made a specialty of this. He will honour a God of fortresses. He will honour with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. A God unknown to his fathers he will honour with gold and silver. Now Josephus records how Herod at different times sent delegations firstly to Julius and then to Octavian in Rome, and to Antony and Cleopatra at different times in Egypt, bearing the most costly gifts. He built a magnificent new seaport, naming it Caesarea in specific honour of Julius. He rebuilt Samaria, naming it Sebastos, meaning which is the ancient equivalent of Augustus. He was the ultimate bootlicker to the Romans. He was. Knew which side his bread was buttered on, and he honoured them in every way he possibly could, while all the time trying to neatly get on with one while having to get on with the other, with all the different machinations that were going on in Rome. He will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god, and will greatly honour those who acknowledge him. The authorised version says, thus shall he do in the most strong... Well, it doesn't even make sense in English, does it? Or the margin says, in fortresses of munitions, with a strange god, whom he shall acknowledge and increase in glory. This is almost impossible to make sense of in some sort of a modern context, but in the ancient Herodian context, in his phenomenal work of redesigning and rebuilding the temple, which was probably Herod's most famous and greatest work, because it was one of the wonders of the world, Herod also took care, wouldn't you believe it, to make it a fortress for his own purposes. And as part of the plan, you see, he constructed on the northern side of that wonderful temple, and overlooking it, a citadel which he named the Tower of Antonia, specifically after Mark Antony, whom he was backing at the time. Josephus says, but for the tower itself, when Herod the king of the Jews had fortified it more firmly than before, he gratified Antonius, who was his friend and the Roman ruler, by calling it the Tower of Antonia. Yes, he knew how to get the Caesars on side, although Mark Antony wasn't quite a Caesar at this stage, he was a would-be. Interesting things about this. In Acts chapter 21, we read of Paul being taken up the steps of the barracks. You remember that, when he was arrested, and the steps of the barracks, that was in the temple area there, and that was the famous Tower of Antonia, the barracks, into the barracks, overlooking the temple. And Roman soldiers were trying to save him from the violence of the crowd. And you might remember in that one, Paul managed to silence the crowd eventually from the steps by motion of his hand, and then he spoke to them in his defence. As I recall, the soldiers ended up having to drag him in for his own safety into the Tower of Antonia. Alright, he will greatly honour those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people and will distribute the land at a price. Herod especially went overboard in honouring the various Roman rulers with whom he had dealings. I've already mentioned Julius and Mark Antony and Octavian. Octavian, who subsequently became Caesar Augustus. Herod was notorious for parcelling out among people who pledged allegiance to him the land adjacent to various strategic sites, just in case, if there was a civil uproar, he'd have his mates. It's called, mates' rates. Have my mate installed there and installed there and installed there. If I need to make a quick exit, I'll have friends along the way. He parcelled out the land. He distributed the land at a price. Now, you might say, well, that's all very fine, but look at verse 40, at the time of the end. Well, that's it. Can't be Herod. The time of the end, can't be. That's it. Well, remember that phrase, the time of the end, may mean one thing in one place and quite another in another place. The meaning is always controlled by the context. When we pick up the Bible and we see the time of the end, we automatically think, oh, now. Well, not necessarily so. It depends how far we want to take the continuous historic view of Daniel 11. You see, in Daniel, we've had a good look at this over the last probably half a dozen weeks. There are two distinct sets of prophecies. We looked at these, chapters 2, 7 and 8, and they relate to the great Gentile powers, and they take us to the end of the times of the Gentiles. Now, end of the times of the Gentiles now, no doubt about that. But chapters 9, 10, 11 and 12 that we've been concentrating on, just reading the 70 weeks in chapter 9 and 10, 11 and 12, they have to do with the history of Daniel's own people in the Holy City. That they are particularly Jewish, and they really focus on the natural Israel, the Jewish nation, as opposed to the great Gentile powers in chapters 2, 7 and 8. 2, Daniel's image, chapter 7 with the beast, chapter 8 with a little horn and the whatever, all that. These latest chapters have mainly to do with the history of Daniel's own people in the Holy City. And hence the expression, the time of the end, in chapters 9, 10, 11 and 12, could refer to the last stage of the national existence of Daniel's people. In other words, finishing with the end of the Herodian dynasty at the end of chapter 11 and the Jewish national existence in AD 70. And I think that's neat, and I think that's appropriate. I think time of the end here in verse 40, at the time of the end all this will happen. I think that makes sense, that with the time of the end we're talking about there is AD 70. As long as we can make Herod somehow or other fit what happened there in verse 40 at the top of the screen. Can we? Well, if this is the case, how does the last bit of chapter 11 about the king of the south and the king of the north fit in with Herod's biography? All right, verse 40, the same. There it is. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him. Who's that him? Remember, this is the question. Is that the king of verse 36, or is it the king of the north? Is it referring back to the long sequence of narrative prior to verse 36? Is Daniel sort of picking up in verse 40 what happened? I mean, is verses 36 to 39 just an interlude, and in verse 40 he picks up the story from the early part of the chapter? So is the first him there, is that the king, or is it the king of the north? At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage the king of the north, perhaps. And the king of the north will storm out against the king of the south with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. And he, the king of the north, while he's about it, will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. You could read it that way. And last time, you might remember, in trying to put all this in a latter day context, I gave you two examples, one of Harry Whittaker and the other Peter Watkins, where they don't agree. Harry Whittaker takes the view that this hymn's all referring to the king in the middle. And Peter Watkins takes the more traditional view, oh no, it's all talking about the king of the north, the interpretation I just put on it then. Who's right? Don't know. Maybe they're both right. Don't know. You recall in the last session that I said, that the key to understanding the prophecy from verse 40 was to identify the person to whom the pronouns him and he refer. Most commentators assume that they are referring to the king of the north, like Peter Watkins, but I said it may be preferable to understand them as simply referring to the king. In other words, neither the king of the north nor the king of the south, but the king in the middle, from verse 36. That's what I said, and I was sort of going along the Harry Whittaker line last time. But, as I often say, what would I know? Herod, the fact is, Herod can fit into this picture, but only as long as we take the traditional view and take the him and the he to refer to the king of the north earlier. Like so. Like this. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him, the king of the north, in battle. It's almost as if, as I said, up to from verses 1 to 35, you've got continuous historic. King of the north, king of the south, Seleucids, Ptolemies, da-da-da-da-da. Verse 36, little interlude, little break. Talks about this other character called the king. Then verse 40, the story again from where we left off. All right? It's almost as though verses 36 to 39 were in parenthesis, and here we get back to the old story. At the time of the end of the Jewish times, the king of the south will engage the king of the north in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against the king of the south with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. And he, the king of the north, while he's about it, will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. Now, there don't appear to be any grammatical or textual clues to help us one way or the other, as I pointed out to begin with. But this construction is entirely possible, and I've come to think it is probable. So let's just run with that and see where it leads us during the time of Herod in the decades leading to the birth of Christ. And I reckon before we do that, it's probably time for a leg stretch and another cup of coffee. So I hope you're sort of with me to date. I don't know. Well, what you got to do, you got to read this stuff. You got to read it. Dennis, are you with me? You're with me. You're not agreeing, though, are you?
I think Herod's got a lot to do with it.
You did? Anyone else had ever thought about Herod in this context?
No.
Yeah, because isn't it?
I thought of Jewish metaphysics, but that doesn't fit, does it?
Okay, well, it's wonderful. You like all this history about... Anyone see the film Cleopatra?
Yes.
Yeah.
you're going to learn all about the history in the next 5 minutes, because I tell you all about Mark Antony and Octavius. It's wonderful stuff. Great romantic drama. And I reckon.
Did Julius Caesar at school?
And I reckon all this stuff about Caesar and then after Caesar, I reckon it's all here in verse 40. So let's have a cup of coffee. You got 5 minutes. 5 minutes leg stretch, because we can't sing a song. 5 minutes. Against him, the king of the south, with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. And he, the king of the north, will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. Can I say that that interpretation is actually the traditional Christadelphian prophetic interpretation, but applied to the 20th and 21st centuries, right? That's the way we've... And we say the king of the north is, I don't know, Russia or Turkey or whatever, and the king of the south has got to be, and because Egypt's a bit of a dead loss, we say, well, perhaps that means America or Britain or something. Or that's the way it's traditionally been taken. So I'm actually saying, let's pick up that, but not apply it to the 20th or 21st century. Let's apply it to the 1st century BC, the years. Let's apply it to the Herod's time, see if it makes sense. What happened? Well, the Roman Republic eventually decided that, there's a bit of a story, that the Seleucid dynasty, the king of the north, was too troublesome to continue, and in 63 BC the Roman commander Pompey, now Pompey was never, he was a bigwig, but he was never the sole ruler over the Roman Republic. He was just a very important general, and Pompey made Syria into a Roman province. Alright? And so from that point on he said, oh, enough of the Seleucids, it's given us too much trouble, well, you're a Roman province, and he annexed it in that time. And so by the time Herod was installed by, not by Pompey, but by Julius Caesar, because Julius Caesar and Pompey, they had a big fight, those two, and Julius won the day and he took over, and Julius became really big. So by the time Herod was installed by the Romans as king of the Jews in 37 BC, some 26 years later, it could be said that the king of the north, for the purposes of Daniel 11, had become the Roman Republic. It had become, because the Seleucid territories were being run by the Romans. Oh, I can handle that. Let's run with that. The king of the north being the Roman Republic. As for the king of the south, well, the Ptolemy king of the day, that dynasty, the Ptolemaic dynasty, was allowed to drift on for a little time, for about some 16 years or so after the Seleucids were annexed. And it was allowed to drift on, but it became weaker and weaker until 47 AD, when Julius Caesar, and Julius was the first of the Caesars really, he basically said it's my way or the highway. That's basically what I say. I mean, total control of the empire. And there was always this thing, if any of you have seen these things like I, Claudius, ever saw that? You know, there was always this battle between, do we go back to the Republic and have the Senate and whatever running, or do we have a Caesar? And there was always that battle, and of course the Caesars ultimately won out. But anyway, Julius Caesar, in 47 AD, he made Cleopatra the queen, together with her 12-year-old brother Ptolemy the 14th, who was the rightful heir or whatever at that time, as co-regent. So, I think he probably thinks, look, we'll make a woman queen down there, I'll be able to do whatever I want, and just, we'll have Ptolemy the 14th. He's the rightful heir, but he's 12, what is he? He's a kid, that's all right, don't worry about that. And you'll pay lots of money to Rome, and we'll get off your back, right? That was Julius Caesar in 47 AD. Now, of course, Julius was assassinated. And then after he was assassinated, there was a civil war in Rome over the succession. And that civil war was basically between Octavian and Mark Antony. Both had been trusted commanders of Julius Caesar. Octavian had basically been almost like an adopted son. In fact, I'm not actually sure whether he might have been adopted as a son by Julius. I'm not sure, but he was very close, and Mark Antony was a great trusted commander of Julius Caesar. And now these two fought for control of the Republic, and it became very willing indeed. Roman civil war. Mark Antony established a power base in Egypt with Cleopatra. And in that sense, in collaboration with Cleopatra, he effectively became the king of the south for the purposes of the Daniel 11 prophecy. We have to make it so if we're going to make sense of this. Is it conceivable, is it credible that we can say Antony and Cleopatra together? I think it is. It's sort of like the last remnants of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the king of the south. Octavian consolidated in and around Rome, and since by now the Seleucid dynasty had long been dismissed and had long since come under the control of Rome, Octavian, for the purpose of this argument, became the king of the north for the purposes of the Daniel 11 prophecy. Again, is that credible? I can run with that too. So you've got basically Rome in civil war together, Octavian in the north, Antony down in the south. And what happens? Well, Antony, the king of the south, made the first move in the civil war, as indeed the prophecy says. It says, at the time of the end, the king of the south will make a push against him. Started with the king of the south. And Antony, the king of the south, made the first move in the civil war. He sailed to Ephesus with Cleopatra and about 800 ships. 600 of them were Roman, about 200 of them were Egyptian. And from there, he marched to Athens with constantly increasing land forces. And for a while it was looking as though Antony was going to win the day. Josephus actually writes, he's reading it, he's writing this in retrospect, when Caesar, Augustus, that's Octavian, was informed of the celerity and magnificence of Antony's preparations, he was afraid of being forced into war that summer, and this would have been most inconvenient for him, for he was in want of almost everything. So at this stage, Antony, if he'd played his cards right, might have won the day. But before we get to the but, interestingly enough, Josephus also lists the auxiliary kings who fought under Antony's banner, including Bocchus of Africa, Polemo of Pontus, Malchus of Arabia, Herod of Judea. Herod had backed Antony. He thought Antony was going to win. And it didn't look like... it looked like that was a pretty good bet at that time, and he supported Antony. And thus, in accordance with Daniel 11 verse 40, we could say that a king of the south was the first to make a push in this war, and he did so with the backing of Herod, the king of the Jews, and the king of verses 36 to 39 of Daniel. But strangely, although Antony's foot soldiers outnumbered those of Augustus, and although his commanders urged him to bring the matter to a head in a land battle, the historian Plutarch comments as follows: "Such a slave was he to the will of a woman, Cleopatra, that to gratify her, though much superior on land, he put his whole confidence in the navy, notwithstanding that the ships had not half their complement of men." Now, I don't understand what was going on here, but apparently Cleopatra, wanted to win it in the navy battle, and he should have gone ahead with the land forces because he outnumbered Octavian. He could have done it, but he went ahead with the sea battle. And then on 2nd of September, 31 BC, Antony's fleet was soundly beaten by Octavian in the famous Battle of Actium, just off the coast of Greece. Now, that's such a famous battle. If you go into places like the Louvre and whatever, you'll find paintings of it and all this. An amazing battle, and it had a huge outcome on how the Roman Empire developed. Antony was defeated, and as a result of that, thus did a king of the north, you could say, come upon a king of the south with a great fleet of ships, to use the words of Daniel 11 verse 40. So far so good. But it didn't end there. After the disaster at Actium, Antony's infantry deserted him. Now, I'm not going to back a loser. Antony flees back across the Mediterranean to Egypt to make his last stand with Cleopatra. Oh, great romantic stuff, isn't it, you know? And Octavian pursues him by land and sea. You never let your enemy get away. Octavian pursues him across the Mediterranean and also down through Judea. And that's exactly what happened. He, Octavian, the king of the north, invaded many countries and swept through them like a flood. He's got the smell of victory in his nostrils, and he's going to knock out Antony for good. Daniel 11 verse 40 says the king of the north, invades many countries, sweeps through them like a flood. And he did. Cilicia, Paphlagonia, Thrace, Pontus, Galatia, Illyria, Armenia, North Africa, to name just a few. He also invaded the beautiful land, as it says in chapter 11 verse 41, because, Josephus writes, Caesar went for Egypt through Syria. When Herod received him with royal and rich entertainment. Hey, this is the same Herod, by the way, who a little while before was backing Antony. He's changed horses. And he gets away with it. Maybe because it just suited Octavian, maybe. I mean, he didn't want a war on the way with the... If Herod's there ready to lick his boots, he might as well play along with it. I suppose he doesn't want a needless war with Herod or something. He doesn't want that. Herod's all for me now, that's fine. He's a weakling, says Octavian. Caesar goes through Egypt, to Egypt, through Syria, comes down. Herod receives him with rich and royal entertainments. And then did he first of all ride along with Caesar as he was reviewing his army about Ptolemy, and feasted with all his friends, and then distributed among the rest of his army what was necessary to feast them withal. That's what it says. He, king of the north, will also invade the beautiful land. Many countries will fall. And this he we're talking about then is Octavian, who became Caesar Augustus, who was, again, a huge historical figure. Huge. And why wouldn't Caesar Augustus be in the prophecy somewhere? He invaded the beautiful land. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hand. What do we make of this? Well, Octavian did actually send an expedition into these countries under one of his commanders, Aelius Gallus, in which he was joined by 500 of Herod's crack palace guards. But history records that, and I think this is from Josephus, the bad success that attended Aelius in this expedition, for whatever reason I'm not sure, deterred both him and others from further attempts. So I imagine, you know, Octavian gets down there, he's keen to get to Egypt, he's keen. Herod's there saying, oh, you wonderful man, you're fantastic. Can't we just perhaps, I don't know, knock off these nasty little people on the side here, Edom, Moab? Okay, we'll send a few troops in there, knock them off in a couple of days. Had difficulty doing it, got out of it, said not going there again. Wasn't important to Augustus. Wasn't important, and they didn't try it again. So Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon were indeed delivered from the hand of the king of the north. He will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape. He will gain control of the treasures of Egypt. Now, when we try to put all this into a 20th century, 21st century context, as I said, we have proper treasures of Egypt. Oh, it's got to be the Suez Canal. Oh, you know, doesn't cut it, in my view. Well, in those days, the treasures of Egypt were of fabulous value. Indeed, they probably were right up to the time of Napoleon. You know, Napoleon actually went over there and sort of took all the stuff back and took it back to the Louvre. That's what happened. And there's marvellous stuff. But certainly in the days of the Romans, the treasures of Egypt were of fabulous value, not like the squalid and poverty-stricken Egypt of our day. So it makes more sense to apply this in that first century context. And thus it was in 30 BC that Julius Caesar's adopted son Octavian drove Antony and Cleopatra to commit suicide, murdered her infant son by Antony, Ptolemy the 15th, Caesarean. I think that's where we get the old Caesarean section from too, I believe. Ptolemy the 15th, Caesarean, annexed the country and gained total control of the treasures of ancient Egypt. Octavian now has total control of the Roman Republic. And that was the end of the Ptolemies. It was also the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. This was the moment when Rome ceased to become the world's policeman and became the world's imperial power, because in the face of his massive accomplishments, the Senate in Rome declared Octavian the rightful successor of Julius Caesar, and he henceforth became Caesar Augustus. And he was the one who was the Caesar there at the birth of Jesus, at the time of the birth of Jesus. But the prophecy goes on to say, but reports or tidings from the east and the north will alarm him. Now, you see, this is where we've got to change the pronouns again. Because this will only make sense in the context of what I'm saying tonight if the him now becomes the king in the middle. Verses 36 to 39. And I know you're going to say that. But what I'm going to say, El says I can't do that. It's too convenient, isn't it? I've got to make sense of this. I've got to make sense of it. And there's nothing grammatically to stop me taking this view. All right? Look, bear in mind, the Daniel that we've got in our English Bible is taken from the Hebrew and it's been through translation, whatever. We don't understand it, but let me just run with this, please. Let me just run. Reports or tidings from the east and the north will alarm the king in the middle. And the king in the middle, Herod, will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. What do you think that might mean? Tidings from the east will alarm him. The identity, as I say, of the he in this passage is not apparent at first instance, but there's nothing in the original text, I've just said that indicates the pronouns have to refer to the one identity throughout. This could be a reference back to the king of verses 36 to 39, Herod. In which case, tidings from the east, oh, come on people, the Magi, looking for the one born king of the Jews. Reports from the east will alarm him. What about the north? Well, first of all, before we get there, and that set Herod off in the insane rage, of course, that resulted in the annihilation of the baby boys of Bethlehem. Tidings from the north. Could be news from Rome, from his oldest son Antipater, whom he didn't like, and who was a despicable character in his own right, that Herod's other two sons, whom Herod had planned to succeed him, had slandered their father in Caesar's presence. And when you're a narcissist like Caesar, and so concerned about pleasing whoever's in Rome, you can't tolerate that. What does he have to do? He has to kill them. And he had them killed. He broke forth in intense fury and took revenge against his two previous sons. He'd already killed another one and their supporters, thus throwing all his succession plans into disarray. Herod is by now an old man. He doesn't have long to go. He'd spent his whole lifetime building up this dynasty that was going to last for, 1,000 years. And he's got all these wonderful sons. And he's killing them off left, right and centre because he can't trust them and they're slandering him into Caesar. And he's still worried that he might be killed himself, and it was a dreadful, dreadful life Herod had got himself into. Tidings from the east, there's a Messiah on the loose. Tidings from the north, from Rome, your sons are bad-mouthing you. And he set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. Herod the Great. He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end and no one will help him. Well, as far as the royal tents, Herod had two magnificent palaces in Jerusalem. One in the temple area, the other in the upper city at the beautiful holy mountain, between the seas, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Dead Sea. Herod was good at palaces. He was good at palaces, good at architecture, good at all that stuff. What more can I say? It fits. And yet he will come to his end and no one will help him. And when you read the history books about the end of Herod, it was a dreadful end. In the last few days he went to another palace at Jericho, I think it was. And according to Josephus, in his old age, Herod was struck with a painful and loathsome disease, and suffering alike from that and from the pangs of guilty fear, yet continued in a course of extreme wickedness to his last hour, seeking no remedy for his evil passions, but exhausting all the resources of the physician's skill to mitigate his bodily distemper and lengthen out his wretched life. And it's apparently, as part of this, I'm told, well, the history books say, that in the last the last week or two of his life, he actually was so concerned that people wouldn't mourn his death that he ordered that 45 of the leading citizens of the day be arrested, rounded up, whatever, and they be killed upon his death, so that at least the nation would be in a mourning mood. They would mourn for the leaders who would be killed. It's a bit like saying, I want to round up all the cabinet in Canberra, the whole lot. They're all to be killed when I die, because otherwise you might be happy, and I don't want that. Herod was a huge character, and if we just try and keep him out of prophecy altogether, it does seem to me to be a bit strange. And in including him in prophecy like this, we're including people like Augustus, who was again huge, Amazing man, Augustus, in many ways. And he was wicked too, but he was one of the great, truly great Caesars. And then after Augustus came, of course, there was the dynasty. There was Tiberius, and was it Caligula, and then Claudius and Nero, and all and so it went on, as they had their kings or their Caesars as well.